To understand the battles being fought today for children with disabilities, it's important to understand the history and traditions associated with public schools and special education. African American students have been traditionally subjected to inequality in educational opportunity. The first significant court case to influence special education actually addressed racial segregation. In Brown versus Board of Education in 1954, it was determined that segregation on the basis of race violated equal educational opportunity. The Brown decision led the way to an understanding that all people, regardless of race, gender, or disability, have a right to a public education. Despite the Brown versus Board of Education, Black children have remained in segregated and unequal educational environments. Children in special educational programs were often relegated to learning environments with less academic rigor, as the focus was on the management of emotional and behavioral issues, learning disabilities, and other impairments rather on academic excellence. According to the NES policy brief, children are held to lower standards due to low teacher expectations. Restrictive school settings and low standards resulted in poorer life outcomes. The Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, the IDEA, implemented in 1997, is the federal law that outlines rights and regulations for students with disabilities in the United States. Under the IDEA, all children with disabilities are entitled to a free, appropriate public education in the least restrictive environment. This law specifies how states and public agencies provide early intervention, special education, and related services. While IDEA sets out to prevent children with special needs from being discriminated against, it's not quite perfect yet. According to the Department of Education, the IDEA aims to ensure fairness in the identification, placement, and discipline of students with disabilities. Yet, disparities persist, and students of color remain more likely to be identified as having a disability and face harsher discipline than their white classmates. When schools have higher numbers of ethnic or minority students enrolled in their special education program that they should have by statistical standards, it signals the possibility that some of the students may not be truly disabled and may have been incorrectly identified. Disproportionality is a problem because it can prevent children from reaching their academic potential, fuel negative stereotypes regarding minority groups, result in lower expectations among teachers, parents, and the students themselves, and prevent schools from recognizing the need to adjust curriculum and teaching methods to reach a broad range of instructional needs of diverse student body. So according to Vulgaris and Segwiger's research on disproportionality, African American students in special education are nearly 2.5 times that of Native Americans, Latino, or students learning English as a second language. Given that culturally and linguistically diverse students, particularly Black children, are less likely to make academic progress and exit special education placements than their white counterparts, and they are more likely to suffer from those long-term consequences. The IDEA is important because it allows students with disabilities to get the education they need to succeed in school. So in order to address those inequities, the IDEA requires states to identify districts with significant disproportionality in special education because it's much more prevalent in students of color with disabilities. I think that like misplacements in special education by cultural biases, deficit thinking, the testing standards, and this placement, the placement processes perpetuate the idea that our minorities are innately inferior, and I think this feeds into the school to prison pipeline. Michelle Alexander, she's the author of The New Jim Crow. She argued that the prison industrial complex is another manifestation of institutional racism, and that social structures become vehicles for racist or discriminatory practices. And I think that the first step in not over identifying minorities is to be reflective. According to the Council for Exceptional Children, in order to address the overrepresentation of African American students in special education, school districts need to understand the seriousness of overrepresentation and commit themselves to reviewing their own programs for any evidence of it. They need to seek guidance from special education laws and policies. They need to use a pre-referral intervention process when referring students for special education. They need to give attention to school climate and how it affects the referral of African American students to special education. And they also need to increase family involvement. And last, provide teachers with increased professional development. Ladson and Billings, author of Culturally Responsive Teaching, states that as teachers, it is important to recognize and reflect on our deeply held beliefs and biases and how they affect students. As a teacher, we can have conversations with our schools to really look at the reasons behind the disproportionality. We can look at the demographics of our students, look at their socioeconomic backgrounds. We can also use prevention. We can ask ourselves, are we doing everything that we can as educators to give our students the best resources and interventions before we refer to special education? I think that by being reflective and putting our students first, thinking about their backgrounds and their cultural backgrounds, will help us in the first steps to make sure that we are referring our students to special education so they can get the services that they need.